I came to share my husband's moment of success, but I was turned away at the door. I am Chloe, 52 years old, and a few nights ago, I stood in the grand lobby of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in Seattle, listening to a young hostess tell me I was not on the guest list for my own company's IPO celebration. Seconds later, security escorted me out like I was a complete stranger. I did not scream. I did not make a scene. I turned around, walked to my car, and sent one single email that dismantled his entire empire. Less than an hour later, my phone started ringing nonstop. But the final call I received that night revealed a betrayal far deeper and more dangerous than I ever imagined. Before I tell you exactly how I took back what was mine, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the people who build empires in the dark should never be pushed out of the light. It was a crisp Seattle evening, the kind of night where the air in the city feels electric with money ambition and the quiet hum of the tech industry. I wore a sapphire blue evening gown. Julian had bought it for me just 2 weeks earlier, leaving it on our bed in a sleek black garment bag with a handwritten note that read, "For the woman who made it all possible." He was 54 now, the charismatic silver-haired CEO of AeroShift Logistics, and in less than 48 hours, he was going to take our company public. The initial public offering was set to value the business at $2 billion. I arrived at the hotel a little after 7. The lobby was a symphony of clinking champagne glasses and expensive cologne. Valets were rushing to park black SUVs, and men in tailored suits were shaking hands with venture capitalists. I carried a small silver clutch. Inside it was a vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen. I had spent months tracking it down through private dealers, and I had paid a premium to have the date of our company's founding engraved right beneath the clip. It was meant to be my gift to him tonight, a quiet reminder of the days when we had nothing but a folding table and a shared dream. I walked up to the registration desk with a confident smile. A young woman in a sharp black suit looked up from her tablet. "Good evening," I said. "Chloe Sterling. I am here for the AeroShift event." Her manicured fingers tapped quickly against the screen. She frowned slightly, her eyes scanning the digital list. Then she cleared her throat. "I am sorry. Could you spell your last name for me?" "Sterling," I replied, maintaining my polite smile. "Sterling." She typed it in again. Her smile faded, replaced by that distinct, practiced expression of corporate apology. "I am so sorry, ma'am, but I do not seem to have your name on the guest list tonight." I let out a soft laugh, assuming it was a simple clerical error. "I am Julian Sterling's wife," I said gently. "I am sure it is just an oversight under the VIP section." She searched a third time. The silence stretched between us, growing heavy and uncomfortable. "I am terribly sorry, Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But you are not listed under the VIPs, the executives, or the general attendees. Please wait here for just a moment." She signaled to a man standing nearby. He wore an earpiece and a navy blue blazer with a discreet security badge. The event manager. He approached me with a rigid posture. "Ma'am, we have cross-referenced the master list. Your name has been explicitly flagged as an unauthorized entry." The knot in my stomach tightened, not from fear, but from a sudden sharp clarity. Someone had not forgotten to put my name on the list. Someone had actively removed it. I looked at the manager. There must be a misunderstanding. "I am the co-founder of this company. Would you please just send someone to tell my husband I am here?" The manager pressed a finger to his earpiece, listening to someone on the other end of the line. He nodded twice. When he looked back at me, his eyes were devoid of any warmth. "I am sorry, Mrs. Sterling." Mr. Sterling personally reviewed and approved the final security protocol for tonight's event 30 minutes ago. He left strict instructions that no unlisted individuals are to be granted access to the ballroom. "We are going to have to ask you to leave the premises." 2 security guards stepped up to flank me. They did not touch me, but their presence was a physical wall, an undeniable threat. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain perfectly steady. I looked past the registration desk, through the massive open double doors leading into the main ballroom. The room was bathed in golden light. Waitstaff circulated with silver trays. A massive screen displayed the AeroShift logo. And then I saw him. Julian was standing near the front of the stage holding a glass of scotch, laughing with the lead underwriters from Goldman Sachs. Something drew his attention toward the entrance. He looked up. Across a sea of 100 people, our eyes locked. For one agonizing second time, completely stopped. I saw the flash of recognition hit his face. I waited for the confusion. I waited for him to excuse himself, to rush over, to demand to know why his wife of 25 years was being surrounded by security. Instead, he did nothing. His expression remained entirely blank. He held my gaze for a moment, lifted his glass to his mouth, and then deliberately turned his back to me. He resumed his conversation as if I did not exist. That was the moment the marriage died. Not with a screaming match, not with a tearful confession. It died in the silence of a crowded room, killed by a man who believed my absence would make his spotlight shine brighter. "Ma'am," the taller security guard said, his voice firm. "We need you to exit the building now." I did not argue. I did not plead. I simply nodded, turned on my heel, and walked out the heavy glass doors of the Fairmont. The cold Seattle air hit my face sharp and biting, but it felt incredibly grounding. As I walked down the street toward where the valet had parked my Tesla, I did not cry. Crying was for women who had lost something valuable. I had merely lost an illusion. My mind began to race, stripping away the emotion and leaving only cold, hard calculations. 10 years ago, I was one of the top financial risk analysts in the Pacific Northwest. I was the one who wrote the original logistical routing algorithms that made AeroShift possible. We built the company together in our garage. But then our daughter Mia was diagnosed with mild autism. She needed occupational therapy, specialized schooling, and a parent who could advocate for her 24 hours a day. Julian and I had a choice to make. The company was growing too fast. One of us had to step back and manage the home front. Society always expects the mother to make that sacrifice. And I did. I quietly transitioned out of the day-to-day operations. I became the invisible architect. I managed our private wealth, reviewed the quarterly tax strategies, and raised our brilliant, beautiful daughter, while Julian became the glossy face of the brand. Over the years, the narrative shifted. He stopped saying we built this. He started saying I built this. I let him have the glory because I thought we were a team. I thought my security was absolute. I reached my car, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cold against my bare arms. I pulled the Mont Blanc pen out of my clutch, stared at it for a second, and tossed it into the passenger seat. Then I reached into the back and grabbed my laptop. Julian thought I was just a housewife now. He thought that because I was not in the boardroom, I no longer held the keys to the castle. He was wrong. I opened the laptop, tethered it to my phone's cellular network, and logged into the secure portal of the Sterling Family Trust. When we incorporated AeroShift, my father, a seasoned corporate lawyer, had insisted on setting up a multi-tiered trust to hold our founding shares. It was designed to protect the assets from hostile takeovers, but it also had a failsafe, a mutual control clause. Neither Julian nor I could liquidate, transfer, or alter the voting rights of our majority shares without the other's explicit digital authorization. But there was also Clause 4B, a defensive mechanism I had drafted myself, an emergency brake meant to be pulled only in the event of suspected fraud, incapacitation, or marital dissolution. I typed in my administrative credentials. The screen glowed softly in the dark car. My fingers flew across the keyboard with muscle memory. I drafted an urgent, legally binding directive to our primary wealth management firm in New York, to the fiduciary board. Pursuant to Clause 4B of the Sterling Family Trust Agreement, I am officially executing an immediate and total freeze on all trust assets, including all Class A voting shares of AeroShift Logistics. Suspend all upcoming equity transfers. Halt the secondary offering. Initiate a forensic audit of all executive disbursements. This freeze is non-negotiable and effective immediately. I read the words twice. There was no going back from this. This email would hit the desks of a dozen high-powered lawyers and bankers. It would act as a massive wrench thrown straight into the engine of Julian's $2 billion IPO. I hit send. I closed the laptop and placed it back on the seat. The city lights of Seattle blurred outside my windshield as a strange, overwhelming sense of calm washed over me. I started the engine and pulled out into the evening traffic. 5 minutes later, the digital display on my dashboard lit up. The caller ID flashed in bright red letters. Julian. He was calling. He never called me during company events. I let it ring. The ringing echoed loudly in the quiet cabin of the car. It stopped and then immediately started again. I tapped the screen to accept the call, putting him on speaker. "Chloe, what the hell are you doing?" His voice was not smooth or charismatic. It was tight, with a barely controlled panic. I kept my eyes on the road. "I am driving home, Julian. It is a beautiful night. Do not play games with me," he snapped. "I just got a frantic call from the underwriter at Goldman Sachs. They received an automated alert from the trust management firm. A Clause 4B freeze. Do you have any idea what you have just done? You are jeopardizing the entire IPO." I took a slow breath. "You jeopardized the IPO when you had security march me out of a building that my algorithms paid for." There was a brief silence on the line. When he spoke again, he tried to adopt a patronizing, soothing tone. "Chloe, listen to me. The guest list was handled by the PR department. It was a mistake. I did not even see you there." I gripped the steering wheel. "I saw you look at me, Julian. You looked right at me and you turned around. Do not insult my intelligence. You wanted to play the bachelor billionaire tonight. You wanted to erase me from the narrative right before the bell rang on Wall Street. Well, the bell is not going to ring. Chloe, unfreeze the trust right now." His voice dropped to a vicious snarl. "You have been sitting at home for 10 years. You do not understand how this works anymore. Hundreds of millions of dollars are on the line. If you do not reverse this by tomorrow morning, I swear to God I will have my lawyers tie you up in court until you have nothing left." I smiled, though he could not see it. "You do not have lawyers anymore, Julian, because my freeze just cut off your access to the corporate retainer accounts. Have a great party." I ended the call and blocked his number. Let him sweat. Let him explain to a ballroom full of investors why his own wife just torpedoed their massive payday. I drove for another 10 miles, turning onto the highway that led toward the quiet suburbs where we lived. I felt powerful. I felt like I had won the first battle. But just as I was merging onto the interstate, my phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a different name, Marcus. Marcus is my younger sister's husband. He is a Black American born and raised in Chicago, and he possesses one of the most ruthless, brilliant financial minds I have ever encountered. He works as a senior forensic accountant for a massive corporate law firm in the Midwest. Over the years, he had quietly acted as my personal sounding board for the trust's tax strategies. I answered immediately. "Marcus, I am guessing you saw the alert from the trust. Chloe, where are you right now?" His voice was devoid of its usual warmth. It was flat, serious, and laced with genuine alarm. "I am driving home," I said, my heart rate picking up again. I froze the trust, Marcus. He had security throw me out of the IPO party. I had to lock him out. "Listen to me very carefully," Marcus said, the sound of keyboard clacking echoing rapidly through the speakers. "Pull over, right now." I frowned, changing lanes and pulling the Tesla onto the shoulder of the highway. The hazard lights blinked rhythmically. "I am pulled over. What is wrong? Is Julian trying to override the freeze?" "No," Marcus replied. "Julian cannot override a 4B clause. You played that perfectly. But Chloe, the moment your freeze went into effect, it triggered an automated audit sweep across all connected corporate accounts. My software just flagged something terrifying." "What is it?" I asked, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Marcus let out a heavy sigh. "Someone on the inside of AeroShift has been preparing for this IPO by draining the executive accounts. I am looking at a ledger that should not exist. Chloe, there is a wire transfer pending clearance at midnight tonight. $5 million. $5 million, I repeated the number, feeling completely absurd. Going where? Marcus paused. Into an offshore shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, a trust account that does not have your name on it. But that is not even the worst part. My mouth went dry. "Tell me." I ran a trace on the authorization signature for the wire. Marcus said, his voice dropping low. "Julian did not sign off on this transfer. The digital signature on the wire authorization belongs to Sienna Kensington." Sienna Kensington, the 32-year-old director of corporate communications for AeroShift, the woman who had ostensibly managed the guest list for tonight's party. Chloe Marcus continued his words, hitting me like physical blows. "I am digging into the metadata of the IPO filings submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission last week. The final draft of the S-1 registration statement. You are not listed as a co-founder. You are not listed as a majority shareholder. What are you talking about? I demanded, my voice trembling for the first time all night. The family trust holds 51% of the company. It is a matter of public record. Not anymore, Marcus said softly. According to a document submitted to the SEC 3 days ago, you signed a voluntary relinquishment of your equity. You supposedly gifted your half of the company back to Julian in exchange for a one-time cash settlement. I felt the blood drain from my face. I never signed anything like that. I know, Marcus said. It is a forgery, a highly sophisticated digital forgery. Chloe, they are not just trying to push you out of the spotlight. Julian and Sienna are attempting to steal the entire company out from under you before the bell rings on Monday morning. And if that wire transfer clears at midnight, they are going to vanish with the cash reserves too. The silence in the car was deafening. The betrayal was no longer just an insult to my pride. It was a calculated criminal conspiracy to erase my life's work and leave Mia and me with absolutely nothing. Chloe, are you still there? Marcus asked. Yes, I whispered. What do you want to do? I looked out at the dark highway, the red taillights of passing cars blurring into a steady stream of fire. The sadness was gone. The shock was gone. Only a cold, burning rage remained. I put the car back in gear. I am coming to your house, Marcus. Boot up every server you have. We are going to war. I pulled my car into the steep driveway of the house on Mercer Island. The Seattle rain had started to fall in heavy sheets, washing over the windshield in relentless waves, but my mind was entirely focused on the glowing windows of the home ahead of me. My sister Maya and her husband Marcus lived in a sleek modern house that overlooked the water. Tonight it was not just a home. It was my only safe harbor and my command center. I left the engine running for a brief moment, taking one final deep breath to steady my racing heart. I was a 52-year-old woman in a wet sapphire evening gown, standing in the cold holding a laptop that contained the keys to a $2 billion empire. I walked up to the front door, but before I could even knock, it swung open. Maya stood there, her expression a mixture of deep concern and fierce protectiveness. She did not ask me how I was feeling. She did not offer empty sympathies. She simply reached out, grabbed my arm, and pulled me inside the warm, brightly lit foyer. Maya knew me better than anyone. She knew that if I was crying, I needed a hug, but if my face was this perfectly calm, I needed a war room. "He is upstairs in the office," Maya said, locking the heavy wooden door behind me. "He has been running traces since you called him from the highway. I made coffee. Black, no sugar, just the way you need it right now." "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady. I kicked off my soaked high heels, leaving them abandoned on the pristine entryway rug, and walked barefoot up the floating glass staircase. Marcus was waiting for me in his office. Marcus is a brilliant Black American man with a mind like a steel trap. He works as a senior forensic accountant and financial investigator for one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in the country. His office was a testament to his profession. The walls were lined with degrees, and his massive oak desk supported 3 large, curved monitors that cast a cold blue light across his face. He looked up as I entered the room. His jaw was set tight. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "Sit down," Chloe Marcus said, pointing to the leather chair beside him. "We have a massive problem, and the clock is ticking down to 0. I sat down, placing my laptop on the edge of his desk. "You mentioned a $5 million wire transfer. Show it to me." Marcus typed a rapid sequence of commands into his keyboard, and the largest monitor in the center of the desk filled with complex banking ledgers and routing numbers. He pointed a steady finger at a highlighted row of data. "When you executed this trust freeze from your car, you triggered an automatic audit sequence across the entire corporate banking network for AeroShift Logistics," Marcus explained. "Because I am listed as your secondary financial proxy, the system sent me the automated flag reports. Look right here. At exactly 6 in the evening, just 1 hour before Julian threw you out of that hotel, an executive authorization was processed to move $5 million out of the company contingency fund." "Where is the money going?" I asked, leaning closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the endless strings of numbers. "It is being routed through a digital clearinghouse in Delaware, and its final destination is an offshore account managed by a private bank in the Cayman Islands," Marcus said. The receiving entity is a limited liability shell company called Azure Holdings. Azure Holdings. I repeated the name, tasting bitter in my mouth. Do we know who owns the shell company? Marcus pressed another button, bringing up a secondary window filled with international registry documents. Shell companies in the Caymans are notoriously difficult to crack because of their strict privacy laws, but whoever set this up made a fatal amateur mistake. They linked the initial funding deposit for Azure Holdings to a domestic credit card. I ran a trace on the card number. He turned his chair to face me fully, his dark eyes locking onto mine. The credit card belongs to Sienna Kensington. Sienna, the 32-year-old director of corporate communications, the woman who had politely smiled at me at the registration desk and told me my name was not on the guest list. She is stealing $5 million from the company contingency fund, I said, trying to process the sheer audacity of the crime. And Julian is letting her do it. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, Chloe. Julian is not just letting her do it. He is orchestrating it. Sienna does not have the executive clearance to bypass the contingency fund security protocols. Someone with ultimate administrative power had to unlock the account first. Julian gave her the access. They are working together. I leaned back in the leather chair, the cold reality washing over me like ice water. I closed my eyes for a moment. My mind immediately flashed back 20 years. I remembered a tiny, drafty house that I had inherited from my grandmother. It was my only personal asset, my only safety net. I remembered Julian sitting on the edge of our worn-out mattress, holding a stack of past due notices from the bank, his shoulders shaking as he cried. He was facing total bankruptcy. He was going to lose the very first warehouse he ever leased. I did not hesitate back then. I sold my grandmother's house. I took every single penny of the equity and I handed him a cashier's check to save his business. I remembered the exact words he said to me that night. He held my face in his hands, looked me in the eyes, and swore that when we finally made it to the top, he would share half the kingdom with me. He promised that my sacrifice would be the foundation of our entire future. Now, 20 years later, he was secretly funneling $5 million to his public relations director on the eve of a $2 billion public offering. Maya walked into the office carrying a tray with 3 steaming mugs of black coffee. She set the tray down on the desk, her eyes darting between my face and the complex financial webs on her husband's monitors. "What is it?" Maya asked, her voice laced with tension. "How bad is the damage?" "They are siphoning money to the Caymans," Marcus said, taking a mug of coffee. "But Maya, that is not even the worst of it. The $5 million is just the getaway money. The real theft is happening on a much, much larger scale." Marcus turned back to his monitors and opened a new file directory. The screen displayed the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. "Chloe, I need you to look at the S1 registration statement," Marcus said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "This is the final, legally binding document that Aeroshift submitted to the federal government to prepare for Monday morning's initial public offering. This document dictates exactly who owns what and who gets paid when the stock goes public." I leaned forward, my financial training immediately taking over. "I know how to read an S1 filing. Bring up the equity distribution table." Marcus scrolled down through dozens of pages of dense legal text until he reached the capitalization section. He highlighted a specific paragraph. "Read the founding shareholder breakdown." I read the words on the screen and my heart completely stopped in my chest. According to the official federal document, the Sterling Family Trust, which was supposed to hold 51% of the company, had been dissolved. The document stated that Julian Sterling was the sole founding shareholder, possessing 100% of the executive voting rights and equity. "My name is gone," I whispered the words, barely making it out of my throat. "My name is completely gone. How is this possible, Marcus? The trust requires mutual consent. He cannot dissolve the trust or transfer the shares without my digital signature and a notarized physical document." Marcus pulled up a scanned PDF file. This was submitted as an addendum to the SEC filing 3 days ago. The document on the screen was a voluntary relinquishment of equity. I stared at the bottom of the page. There, in stark black ink, was my signature. It looked absolutely perfect. The loop of the C, the sharp angle of the H, the slight trailing fade at the end of my last name. Below my signature was a notary stamp officially verifying that I had signed the document in person. "I never signed this," I said, my voice rising in panic. "I never walked into a notary office. I never agreed to this. Marcus, this is a total forgery." "I know it is a forgery," Marcus said, his fingers flying across the keyboard again. "But it is an incredibly good one. Julian used a corrupt notary to stamp the document, and he used a high-resolution digital copy of your signature from an old tax return to fake your consent. Do you understand what he has done, Chloe? He has legally stolen your entire half of the company." I stood up from the chair, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal suffocating me. He is not just trying to push me out of the spotlight. He is trying to leave me with absolutely nothing. When the bell rings on Wall Street on Monday morning, the company will be valued at $2 billion, and I will not own a single share. I will be entirely erased. Maya grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. "We will fight this. We have the proof that it is forged. We will go to the authorities." "We are going to do much more than that," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, because I did not stop digging when I found the forged signature. I wanted to know how Sienna Kensington was managing this much paperwork without leaving a massive digital footprint on the corporate servers, so I ran a trace on the IP address that uploaded the forged document to the SEC portal. He opened a completely separate window on his computer. The IP address pinged back to a private encrypted cloud storage drive. It is a hidden server paid for by the same credit card Sienna used to open the shell company in the Cayman Islands. It is essentially a digital vault where she and Julian have been hiding their tracks. "Can you crack it?" I asked, staring at the password prompt on the screen. Marcus gave a cold, confident smile. "I already did. I used a brute force algorithm while you were driving over here. I was looking for financial ledgers, hidden bank accounts, or maybe blackmail material. But what I found was something entirely different." Marcus clicked a folder labeled Aspen Itinerary. The screen instantly filled with dozens of high-resolution photographs. I felt the breath get knocked completely out of my lungs. The photos were of Julian and Sienna. They were not corporate event photos. They were deeply, undeniably intimate. There were pictures of them drinking wine in a luxury ski lodge wrapped in thick blankets. There were pictures of them kissing on a private balcony overlooking the snow-covered mountains. Julian looked younger, happier, and completely relaxed in a way he had not been around me for years. I stared at the timestamps located in the bottom corners of the images. February of last year. I placed my hands flat on the wooden desk to steady myself. Last February, Julian told me he was attending a mandatory supply chain summit in Denver. He told me the schedule was grueling, that he would be in conference rooms for 14 hours a day, and that he would barely have time to call me. Instead, he was in Aspen, holding his public relations director by the waist and smiling into the camera. Maya gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand as she looked at the screen. "Chloe, I am so sorry." I did not look away from the photographs. I studied them with a terrifying clinical detachment. I examined the way his hand rested on her leg. I examined the expensive diamond necklace she was wearing, a necklace I had seen on our joint credit card statement categorized as a client appreciation gift. "How long?" I asked, my voice completely flat. "How long has this been going on?" Marcus opened another folder. "Based on the digital trail, at least 2 years. But Chloe, you need to brace yourself. There is one more layer to this. This is the real reason Julian is executing the hostile takeover right now. This is the reason he is risking federal prison by forging your signature on the SEC documents." Marcus clicked on a PDF file titled Swedish Medical Concierge. It was a scanned medical invoice from one of the most exclusive private medical clinics in downtown Seattle. The patient name listed at the top was Sienna Kensington. The billing guarantor, the person paying for the premium medical care out of pocket, was Julian Sterling. I read the itemized list of medical services. First trimester ultrasound, advanced fetal DNA screening, prenatal vitamin infusions, private delivery suite reservation. "She is pregnant," I stated, the words sounding hollow in the quiet room. "She is roughly 14 weeks pregnant," Marcus confirmed gently. The entire grand design, the massive, horrifying puzzle, suddenly snapped perfectly into place inside my mind. It was never just about greed, and it was never just about a midlife crisis affair. It was an exit strategy. It was a complete systematic replacement of his current reality. I looked at Maya, then at Marcus, my vision crystal clear. "He's going to wipe me out entirely," I said, outlining the strategy aloud, as if analyzing a hostile corporate competitor. He forged my signature to steal my 51% of the company. He scheduled the IPO for Monday morning to turn those stolen shares into massive, untraceable liquid cash. The $5 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands is his safety net, a hidden nest egg for him and Sienna, just in case the SEC investigates the public offering. Marcus nodded slowly in agreement. He is cashing out his empire, stealing your half of the fortune, and starting a brand new family. And because he fired his current legal team to use Sienna's private lawyers, he thinks he has covered all his tracks. Once the bell rings on Monday, Julian is going to walk into our house, hand me divorce papers, and tell me that since I voluntarily signed away my rights, I get absolutely nothing. I continued, my voice growing colder and sharper with every word. He planned to leave Mia and me with no company, no equity, and no future, while he rides off into the sunset with a $2 billion valuation and a brand new heir. "He thought you would just quietly step aside," Maya said, her eyes flashing with anger. "He thought because you stayed home to take care of Mia for the last 10 years, you became weak. He thought you forgot how to fight." I reached out and picked up my cold black coffee. I took a slow sip, letting the bitter taste wash over my tongue. I did not feel sad. I did not feel heartbroken. The woman who loved Julian Sterling had died the moment he turned his back on me in the hotel lobby. The woman standing in this office right now was the original financial risk analyst who built the logistical foundation of Aeroshift Logistics with her own bare hands. "Marcus," I said, setting the coffee mug down on the desk with a firm, definitive thud, "you said my freeze command on the trust locked him out of the corporate retainer accounts." "Yes," Marcus replied. "Your Clause 4B freeze is absolute. He cannot move a single penny legally. The only money he has access to right now is whatever is in his personal checking account. But Chloe, the $5 million wire transfer to the Caymans is still sitting in the pending clearance queue. It clears at midnight. That is exactly 2 hours from now. If that money leaves the country, it will be incredibly difficult to claw it back." "We are not going to claw it back," I said, pulling my laptop toward me and opening the screen. "We are going to sever the artery entirely. I want you to draft an emergency injunction to the Federal Banking Commission citing suspected wire fraud and unauthorized access to contingency funds. Attach the IP logs from Sienna's server." Marcus smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that told me he was entirely ready for war. "Consider it done." "But what about the forged SEC documents? If the IPO proceeds on Monday, the shares are gone." "The shares are absolutely irrelevant," I replied softly, my mind racing 10 steps ahead of Julian's pathetic master plan. Julian is playing checkers, trying to steal the physical shares of the company. He forgot that I am the one who designed the entire board. I looked up at the glowing monitors, staring at the Aeroshift Logistics logo in the corner of the screen. "Maya, I need you to go to my house right now," I said, turning to my sister. "The security system is currently disabled because Julian is still at the hotel playing the hero. Go to my private safe in the basement. The passcode is Mia's exact time of birth. Inside, you will find a thick red leather folder containing the original incorporation documents from 20 years ago." "What is inside the folder?" Maya asked, already grabbing her car keys from the table. "It is the single piece of paper Julian forgot about," I said quietly. "He thinks he owns the company because he stole the stock, but he forgot that the company does not actually own the technology." I turned back to Marcus, the blueprint of Julian's total destruction perfectly mapped out in my mind. Julian and Sienna think they are going to wake up on Monday morning as billionaires, but they are about to learn a very painful lesson about corporate law. You cannot sell a house if you do not own the land it was built on. By the time the sun comes up, I am going to make sure Julian Sterling does not even own the chair he sits on. "Start drafting the FBI fraud report, Marcus. We have a lot of work to do before midnight." Marcus stopped typing for a moment. He turned his chair away from the glowing monitors and looked directly at me. The cold blue light from the screens cast deep shadows across his face. The anger in his eyes was no longer just professional. It was deeply personal. "Chloe, look at me," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, steady register. "Do you remember what happened 20 years ago, before the venture capital, before the glass towers and the private jets? I met his gaze, my hands resting flat on the wooden desk. I remember everything. Marcus leaned forward. Julian wants to rewrite history for the federal regulators. He wants to convince Wall Street that he built this $2 billion empire all by himself. But I have the original banking ledgers from 2 decades ago. I know exactly how this company was born, because I was the one who processed the legal paperwork. He tapped a single key on his keyboard. A scanned image of a faded bank deposit slip appeared on the center monitor. The date was 20 years ago. The amount was $250,000. That was not Julian money. Marcus stated his words, hitting the quiet room like a hammer. Julian was completely bankrupt. The commercial banks had denied his final loan extension. He was 48 hours away from losing his very first warehouse. He had absolutely nothing. That money came from you, Chloe. You sold the only piece of property your parents left you. You sold your childhood home, took every single penny of your inheritance, and you handed it to a man who was drowning. Maya stood quietly in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I remember that night, she whispered. He was crying in our kitchen. He got down on his knees and held your hands. He made a promise to you. Marcus continued, his tone sharp and unrelenting. I heard him say it, Chloe. He swore that if you saved him, he would spend the rest of his life making sure you owned half of the kingdom. He swore that your sacrifice would be the permanent foundation of everything he built. And now he is trying to forge your signature to steal that kingdom and give it to a woman he was kissing in Aspen while you were home taking care of your daughter. The silence in the office was absolute. The soft hum of the computer servers was the only sound in the room. I stared at the faded deposit slip on the screen. It was the undeniable proof of my sacrifice. Julian had spent a decade slowly convincing the world, and almost convincing me, that I was just the quiet wife standing in his shadow. But Marcus was right. I was not the shadow. I was the foundation. And a building cannot survive when you destroy its foundation. You are right, Marcus, I said, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. He promised me half the kingdom. But since he decided to commit federal fraud to steal my half, I am no longer interested in sharing. I reached for my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys. I want to take the whole thing. Show me the exact routing numbers he is using for the offshore accounts. Let us burn his kingdom to the ground. Marcus did not stop typing. His fingers hammered the keyboard with a brutal rhythm. He bypassed the standard banking ledgers and opened a direct portal to the Securities and Exchange Commission database. He pulled up the official S-1 registration statement. This was the final legally binding document AeroShift had submitted to the federal government to prepare for the initial public offering on Monday morning. Chloe, look at the equity distribution table, Marcus said. His voice was no longer just professional. It was deadly serious. I leaned closer to the monitor. I scanned the capitalization section, expecting to see the Sterling Family Trust listed with its 51% controlling interest. Instead, the page was completely wrong. My name was not listed under the co-founders. My name was not listed under the majority shareholders. According to the federal government, Julian Sterling was the sole creator and owner of the entire empire. How did he bypass the trust mandate? I asked, my blood turning to ice. He cannot legally remove me without my physical signature. Marcus pulled up an addendum file attached to the back of the federal filing. He clicked it open. He did not bypass it, Chloe. He forged it. The document on the screen was titled Voluntary Relinquishment of Equity. I stared at the bottom of the digital page. There, in stark black ink, was my exact signature. It was a flawless replica. The precise curve of the first letter, the sharp angles, the familiar fade at the end. Below it was a fraudulent notary stamp, officially verifying that I had willingly surrendered my half of a $2 billion company for absolutely nothing. Julian was not just pushing me out of the spotlight. He had committed a massive federal securities fraud to erase my existence entirely. He was preparing to ring the bell on Wall Street on Monday morning using a stolen company. Marcus did not stop with the federal documents. He traced the digital footprint of the forged signature back to its source. The trail led directly to a private cloud server paid for by the exact same credit card Sienna used to open the offshore accounts. Marcus broke through the encryption in less than 2 minutes. He clicked open a hidden folder labeled Aspen Itinerary. The screen instantly filled with dozens of high-resolution photographs. I felt the breath get knocked completely out of my lungs. These were not corporate event photos. There were pictures of Julian and Sienna kissing on a private balcony overlooking the snow-covered mountains. Julian looked younger and completely relaxed in a way he had not been around me for years. I stared at the timestamps located in the bottom corners of the images. February of last year. That was exactly when Julian told me he was attending a mandatory supply chain summit in Denver. But Marcus was already opening another file. "Chloe, you need to brace yourself," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steady whisper. "There is one more layer to this, and it explains everything." He pulled up a scanned medical invoice from one of the most exclusive private clinics in downtown Seattle. The patient name listed at the top was Sienna Kensington. The billing guarantor, the person paying for the premium medical care out of pocket, was Julian Sterling. I read the itemized list of medical services: first trimester ultrasound, advanced fetal DNA screening, private delivery suite reservation. "She is pregnant." I stated the words sounding completely hollow in the quiet room. Marcus nodded slowly. "She is roughly 14 weeks along." The entire grand design suddenly snapped perfectly into place inside my mind. This was never just about a midlife crisis affair. It was a complete systematic replacement of his current reality. Julian was executing a hostile takeover of my entire life. He forged my signature to steal my 51% of the company. He scheduled the public offering for Monday morning to turn those stolen shares into massive, untraceable liquid cash. The $5 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands was his safety net, just in case the federal regulators asked questions. Once the bell rang on Wall Street, Julian was going to walk into our house and hand me divorce papers. He planned to tell me that since I voluntarily signed away my rights, I would get absolutely nothing. He planned to leave our daughter and me with no company and no future, while he officially started a brand new family as a billionaire with his shiny new heir. He thought I would just quietly step aside and let him take everything I built. He thought I would cry and surrender. He was about to learn how incredibly wrong he was. Monday morning arrived with the cold gray light typical of Seattle, but inside the executive boardroom on the 40th floor of the AeroShift Logistics Building, it looked like a victory parade. The room smelled of expensive espresso and unearned arrogance. Crystal champagne flutes clinked against each other. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the city looked small and easily conquered. Julian sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, looking like the perfect visionary chief executive. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit, smiling widely as he shook hands with the lead underwriters and the board of directors. They were less than 2 hours away from ringing the opening bell on Wall Street. They thought they were about to become billionaires. I did not knock. I placed both hands on the heavy glass double doors and pushed them open so hard they hit the metal stoppers with a loud, violent crack. The laughter in the room died instantly. Every head turned toward the entrance. I stepped into the boardroom. I was not wearing an evening gown this time. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit with sharp shoulders and black leather heels that clicked methodically against the hardwood floor. I was no longer the quiet wife who stayed home to manage the family. I was the financial risk analyst who built the foundation they were currently standing on. Marcus walked exactly one step behind me. He wore a pristine black suit, his expression carved from absolute stone. In his right hand, he carried a thick black leather briefcase that contained every single one of Julian's hidden sins. Julian froze. His champagne glass hovered halfway to his mouth. For a split second, I saw genuine panic flash in his eyes, but he had spent a decade perfecting his public relations mask. He quickly set the glass down and stood up, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He put on a face of deep manufactured sympathy, designed entirely for the audience in the room. "Chloe. Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" Julian said, taking a slow step toward me, holding his hands up like he was trying to calm a frightened animal. He looked past me to the board of directors, shaking his head with a sad, patronizing smile. "I apologize, everyone. My wife has been under a tremendous amount of mental stress lately. The pressure of caring for our special needs daughter has taken a severe toll on her health." He reached out to touch my arm. "Let us go home, Chloe. You are confused. I will have security escort you down to the car." I did not step back. I looked him dead in the eyes and spoke in a voice so cold and clear it cut through the room like a razor. Do not touch me, Julian, and do not ever use our daughter as an excuse for your crimes again." Julian dropped his hand, his jaw tightening. He lowered his voice to a vicious whisper meant only for me. "You are embarrassing yourself, Chloe. Get out of my building before I have you arrested for trespassing." I stepped past him, ignoring his threat completely. I walked directly to the center of the mahogany table. The board members stared at me in stunned silence. "My name is Chloe Sterling," I said, projecting my voice to the farthest corners of the room. "I am the co-founder and the rightful majority shareholder of AeroShift Logistics. And as of Friday night, I am the person who initiated the Clause 4B freeze on your operating accounts." The room erupted into chaos. The chairman of the board, a wealthy venture capitalist named Richard, slammed his hands on the table. "You are the one who locked the trust accounts," he demanded, his face turning red. "Do you have any idea the kind of panic you caused this weekend? We have an initial public offering in 90 minutes. We had to call in emergency legal teams just to keep the underwriters from pulling out." Julian rushed forward, placing himself between me and the board chairman. "Richard, please do not listen to her. She does not know what she is saying. We already resolved the trust issue. I have the signed relinquishment documents right here in my office. She has no legal standing in this building." That is when Marcus stepped forward. He placed his heavy leather briefcase flat on the mahogany table. The loud thud echoed against the glass walls, causing several board members to flinch. Marcus did not yell. He did not need to. His physical presence and absolute authority commanded the entire room. "My name is Marcus Vance." "Marcus," said his deep voice carrying a lethal professional weight. "I am a senior forensic accountant and the appointed legal proxy for Mrs. Chloe Sterling. I strongly suggest you all sit down and close your mouths, because this is no longer a corporate celebration. This is a federal compliance intervention." Julian glared at Marcus, his face twisting with arrogant rage. "You have no jurisdiction here, Vance. You are her brother-in-law, not a corporate attorney. Security is already on their way up." Marcus popped the brass latches on his briefcase. "I am a licensed financial investigator, Julian, and unless you want the Federal Bureau of Investigation walking through those doors instead of your private security guards, you will let my client speak." Richard, the board chairman, held up a hand, signaling Julian to stop talking. He looked at Marcus with narrowed eyes. "What exactly are you alleging, Mr. Vance? Our lawyers cleared the SEC filings yesterday. Julian holds 100% of the executive voting rights. Chloe voluntarily surrendered her equity." I looked directly at Richard. I surrendered absolutely nothing. I reached into the open briefcase, took out a thick stack of printed documents, and dropped them right in front of the chairman. "That is a forensic digital analysis of the Securities and Exchange Commission S-1 registration statement," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "The document you submitted to the federal government claiming I gave up my 51% stake contains a forged signature. Julian used a high-resolution scan from an old tax return and bribed a corrupt notary to stamp it." The color drained from Richard's face. He looked down at the documents and then looked up at Julian. "Julian, what is she talking about?" "She is lying," Julian shouted, his polished demeanor finally cracking. "She is a bitter, unstable woman trying to extort me on the biggest day of my career. The signature is real." I watched her sign it. Marcus pulled a second folder from the briefcase and slid it down the table. "Then perhaps you can explain the digital metadata we pulled from the corporate servers," Marcus said smoothly. "Because that forensic report proves the forged document was uploaded from a private encrypted cloud server, a server paid for by a shell company in the Cayman Islands, a shell company that is currently holding a pending wire transfer of $5 million stolen directly from the AeroShift contingency fund." The boardroom went completely dead. The underwriters from Goldman Sachs stopped writing on their legal pads and stared at Julian in absolute horror. In the corporate world, you can survive a bad quarter. You can survive a PR scandal. But you cannot survive stealing from the contingency fund and lying to the federal government. Julian stepped back, his chest heaving, as he realized the walls were rapidly closing in. "You cannot prove any of that," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. "I do not have to prove it to you, Julian," I said, stepping around the table until I was standing inches away from him. "I already proved it to the Federal Banking Commission. We filed the emergency injunction at 2 o'clock this morning. The wire transfer to the Cayman Islands has been frozen. Your offshore account has been seized. I turned to face the entire board of directors. My tone was no longer a warning. It was a promise of total destruction. If any of you authorize the opening of this stock on the public market this morning, I said, locking eyes with Richard, you will be actively participating in the sale of stolen assets. You will all be indicted for federal securities fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. I will personally make sure the Securities and Exchange Commission dismantles this entire board, and I will take every single one of your personal fortunes in the civil suits that follow. The silence in the glass room was deafening. The empire Julian had spent 10 years stealing was crumbling to dust in less than 5 minutes. Julian took a deep breath and let his shoulders drop. He looked at the board of directors with a perfectly practiced expression of exhausted sorrow. He did not yell. He did not look angry. He looked exactly like a man carrying a heavy and tragic personal burden. "Richard, I am so sorry about this interruption," Julian said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "I wanted to keep this a private family matter. But since my wife has decided to bring her delusions into this boardroom, I have no choice but to be completely transparent with all of you." He walked slowly toward me, holding his hands up in a placating, gentle gesture. "Chloe has not been well," Julian continued, addressing the room while looking at me with absolute pity. "The stress of managing our home, the endless demands of raising our special needs daughter, and the difficult hormonal changes she is going through at this stage of her life have caused a severe break from reality. She has been suffering from paranoid episodes and extreme anxiety for months." The men in the boardroom exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few of them looked at me with immediate sympathy. Not sympathy for me, but for the poor, successful husband who had to deal with an unstable wife. It was the oldest trick in the corporate playbook. Label the woman crazy, blame her biology, and completely dismiss her authority. I did not scream. I did not frantically defend my mental health. I knew that reacting with anger would only validate the narrative he was spinning. I just stood completely still and let him keep digging his own grave. Julian walked over to his leather briefcase at the head of the table. He snapped it open and pulled out a crisp manila folder. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table directly toward the board chairman. "I have been trying to protect her dignity," Julian said softly. "But this is the voluntary relinquishment of equity. Chloe signed it herself 3 days ago in the presence of a licensed notary. She agreed to step away from the family trust completely so she could focus entirely on getting the psychiatric help she so desperately needs right now. She has no legal standing in this company anymore." The trust freeze she attempted last night was just another manic episode. Richard picked up the piece of paper, examining the signature at the bottom. He let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. The tension in the room instantly evaporated. The board members relaxed back into their expensive leather chairs. The crisis was averted. They had their convenient scapegoat. The crazy menopausal wife was safely dealt with, and their $2 billion public offering was back on track. Julian turned toward the glass doors, where 2 massive security guards had just arrived. "Please escort my wife down to her car," Julian instructed them in a hushed, caring tone. "Be gentle with her. She is not in her right mind today." The 2 guards stepped into the room, walking purposefully toward me. I looked at the forged documents sitting on the table. Then I looked at Julian. He was looking back at me with a cold, victorious smirk hidden just beneath his mask of manufactured sorrow. He actually believed he had won. He actually believed that a few fake tears and a forged piece of paper were enough to erase 20 years of my life. I did not back away when the security guards approached. I simply raised a single hand, and the absolute authority in my posture made them stop dead in their tracks. I ignored them completely and turned my attention back to the board of directors. Julian loves to tell financial magazines that he is a visionary who built the predictive routing models that made this company a global powerhouse. I said, my voice perfectly steady and echoing off the glass walls. But the truth is, I am the one who wrote the original 700 lines of Python code in our freezing garage while he was still struggling to understand basic supply chain management. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the board chairman. If I am so mentally unstable, Richard, then you need to ask yourself why the core infrastructure of your entire $2 billion network still relies entirely on the exact logistical algorithms I designed 20 years ago. The board chairman froze. The underwriters from Goldman Sachs slowly lowered their pens and exchanged nervous glances. Julian felt the sudden shift in the room. His confident smirk vanished completely. He realized in that exact moment that you cannot gaslight the architect of the building you are standing in. Marcus stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute authority in his tone commanded the entire room. He looked directly at the board chairman. "Richard, I highly suggest you turn to the second page of the forensic report sitting right in front of you," Marcus said. Julian may have found a corrupt notary to stamp a fake signature on that piece of paper, but he completely forgot that federal filing portals track digital metadata. Digital footprints do not lie. Richard hesitantly opened the folder. Julian tried to reach for it, but Marcus slammed his hand flat on the table, stopping him instantly. "The document claiming my client surrendered her equity was uploaded exactly 48 hours ago," Marcus explained, his eyes locked on the board of directors. "But it was not uploaded from her home network. It was not signed in a lawyer's office. The IP address for the digital submission traces directly to a private terminal inside this very building, specifically the office of your Director of Corporate Communications." A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. Marcus let the reality of the situation sink in for a brief second before delivering the final fatal blow. "You are holding a forged legal document, deliberately submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission." Marcus stated, his voice ringing like a judge reading a sentence. "In the United States, that is not a simple corporate misunderstanding or a marital dispute. That is a Class B federal felony. It is severe securities fraud. Anyone in this room who signs off on this public offering today, knowing that the founding equity was stolen, will be immediately indicted as a co-conspirator." I watched the blood completely drain from Richard's face. His hands started to shake. The underwriters from Goldman Sachs dropped their pens onto the table and physically backed their chairs away from the documents. The wealthy venture capitalists, who had been drinking champagne and laughing just 5 minutes ago, were suddenly staring at the very real possibility of federal prison time. The entire board of directors turned absolutely pale. The panic in the boardroom was absolute. But as I watched the wealthy venture capitalists scrambling for their phones to call their defense attorneys, I noticed something terrifying. Julian was not panicking anymore. He was standing at the head of the mahogany table staring at me. And then he started to laugh. It was a slow, dark sound that sent a sudden chill down my spine. The room fell completely silent again as Julian straightened his expensive jacket and took a step toward me. The arrogant mask was back, but this time it was laced with pure venom. "Do you honestly think a simple trust freeze is enough to stop me, Chloe?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You always were too focused on the small details to see the bigger picture. You think I put all my eggs in this public offering basket?" He walked back to his open leather briefcase. He ignored the forged federal documents sitting on the table and pulled out a different file. It was a massive bound folder stamped with the gold seal of the Vanguard Investment Group. "I knew you might try something desperate if you ever found out about Sienna," Julian said, slamming the heavy folder onto the glass table. "I knew you would try to use the family trust to lock me out of my own money, so I made a backup plan. I do not need the public market to make me a billionaire, and I certainly do not need your permission to sell." He looked around the room at the terrified board members and offered them a sickening, victorious smile. "Gentlemen, you can cancel the bell ringing," Julian announced smoothly. "The public offering is officially dead. But do not worry about your payouts, because as of midnight last night, Aeroshift Logistics is no longer an independent company." I stared at the Vanguard folder as my heart skipped a beat. Julian turned his attention back to me, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. "I signed a private mergers and acquisitions deal with the Vanguard Group." Julian sneered, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. "They are buying the entire company in a private equity buyout for $2 billion in cash. The contract is ironclad and the ink is already dry. Your little freeze only affects the public shares. This private buyout bypasses the family trust entirely through a corporate loophole my new legal team finalized last night." Julian took a step closer, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive espresso and arrogance on his breath. "No matter what you do, the money is going straight into my accounts," Julian whispered. "Vanguard is taking over the board today, and the very first thing their corporate restructuring team is going to do is legally terminate your founder status and throw you out on the street. You played a good game, Chloe, but you still lost everything." I walked out of the glass corporate tower, and the cold Seattle wind hit my face. I did not look back. Marcus walked beside me in total silence. Julian thought his private equity deal with the Vanguard Group was the ultimate checkmate. He thought he had outsmarted the family trust by bypassing the public market entirely. But Julian always had a fatal flaw. He never actually read the fine print. We got into my car, and I drove us away from the downtown skyscrapers. I did not drive to a law office or a bank. I drove straight to the industrial district on the south side of the city. I pulled up to a massive, weathered brick building surrounded by loading docks and idling semi-trucks. This was the original AeroShift Central Warehouse. This was the exact place where 20 years ago Julian and I had celebrated our first major contract by eating cheap pizza on a stack of wooden pallets. The moment I walked through the heavy metal doors, the familiar smell of diesel fuel, corrugated cardboard, and cheap coffee washed over me. The roar of forklifts and conveyor belts was deafening. These were the people who actually kept the empire running. The drivers, the dispatchers, the floor managers. Many of them had been with us since the very beginning. A veteran floor manager named Thomas spotted me from the loading bay. His hair was entirely gray now, but he still wore the same faded AeroShift jacket I gave him 15 years ago. He waved at me with a warm, genuine smile, completely unaware of the corporate slaughter Julian had just authorized in a glass boardroom miles away. I smiled back, but my chest tightened with a heavy, sickening dread. Marcus set his briefcase down on a metal shipping crate in a quiet corner of the warehouse. He opened his encrypted tablet and immediately went to work. If Julian signed a binding acquisition contract with Vanguard last night, then the digital copy has to be logged in the primary corporate legal server. Marcus set his fingers flying across the screen. Julian is arrogant, but Vanguard is institutional. They leave a massive paper trail. It took Marcus less than 10 minutes to bypass the internal security walls and download the master merger agreement. He opened the file and began speed reading through hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon. I stood beside him watching the endless paragraphs of the private equity buyout scroll past. At first glance, it looked like a standard corporate acquisition. Vanguard was purchasing all operational assets and assuming total control of the company. But then Marcus stopped scrolling. He zoomed in on an appendix titled Post-Merger Restructuring and Synergy Optimization. Marcus went completely still. The confident energy he carried all morning suddenly vanished. He looked up at me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine horror in his eyes. "Chloe, you need to read this," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Julian did not just sell the company to Vanguard, he sold the people. I leaned over the tablet and read the highlighted paragraphs. My blood ran completely cold. Vanguard is a private equity firm that specializes in stripping companies down to the bone to maximize short-term profits. And Julian had eagerly handed them the knife. The contract contained a mandatory workforce reduction clause. In order to guarantee his $2 billion payout, Julian had legally agreed to terminate 60% of the senior workforce within 30 days of the acquisition. But it was worse than just mass layoffs. I kept reading, and the true depth of Julian's cruelty revealed itself on the screen. Julian had authorized a complete liquidation of the legacy employee pension fund. The contract specifically targeted the veteran workers, the drivers who had spent 20 years destroying their backs loading our trucks, the warehouse managers who worked night shifts so Julian could sleep in a luxury penthouse. Julian had agreed to classify their early retirement packages as redundant liabilities. He was legally stripping away their pensions and cutting their comprehensive health care benefits just to artificially inflate the final purchase price of the company. "He is going to fire everyone over the age of 50, Marcus said, staring at the screen in disbelief. "He is wiping out their retirement funds so he can add another zero to his personal bank account. This is an absolute bloodbath." I looked away from the tablet and stared out across the warehouse floor. I watched Thomas guiding a forklift loaded with heavy freight. I saw Maria, a dispatcher who had worked for us for 18 years, talking on a radio. These people had families. They had mortgages. They had trusted Julian and me with their entire livelihoods, and Julian was about to throw them all into the streets with absolutely nothing just to fund his new life with Sienna. This was no longer just a bitter divorce. This was no longer just about Julian stealing my money or erasing my name from the history of the company. This was a systemic corporate massacre. Julian thought he could use the Vanguard buyout to finally crush me. He thought the private equity firm was his ultimate shield. But he did not realize that by targeting the workers, he had just given me the exact ammunition I needed to destroy the entire deal. "Close the tablet, Marcus," I said, my voice turning to absolute ice. "Julian thinks he can sacrifice these people to buy his freedom, but he forgot one very important detail about the algorithms I built to run this company." Marcus looked up at me, waiting for the instruction. "Call the Federal Labor Board," I told him, "and then get me the direct phone number for the Senior Acquisition Director at the Vanguard Group. It is time to let Wall Street know that they are buying a sinking ship." I walked slowly down the massive concrete aisles of the central warehouse. The towering steel shelves on either side of me were stacked high with pallets of freight ready to be shipped across the country. Every few feet I passed a familiar face. Men and women who had spent their entire adult lives building this company right alongside me. I stopped near the dispatch center and saw Maria. She was a single mother who started answering phones for us 18 years ago. Now, she was a senior logistics coordinator. She had just sent her oldest son to college using the AeroShift employee tuition program, a program Julian was planning to terminate completely to inflate his buyout price. A few yards away, Thomas parked his forklift and walked over to me, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. His smile was warm, but his eyes were heavy with a quiet, unspoken anxiety. He did not ask me about the corporate drama downtown or the rumors of the public offering. He just looked at me and asked a single terrifying question. He asked if their pensions were going to be safe. That single question hit me harder than any of the lies Julian had told me. It hit me harder than the forged federal documents or the photographs of him kissing Sienna in Aspen. Julian was treating these loyal employees like disposable assets on a balance sheet. He was willing to strip away their retirement funds and cancel their health insurance just to secure his billionaire status. He was sacrificing real lives to feed his own ego. I looked at Thomas and promised him that nobody was going to touch his pension. As I walked back toward Marcus, I felt a profound shift inside my chest. The lingering sting of a broken marriage completely vanished. This fight was no longer about a scorned wife seeking petty revenge against a cheating husband. It was not about jealousy or pride. It was about raw survival. Julian had turned hundreds of hardworking American families into collateral damage for his private equity deal. He had made them his scapegoats. But he made one massive miscalculation. He forgot that I was the one who hired every single one of these people. They were my people, and I was going to burn his entire private equity deal to the ground before I let him steal a single dollar from their futures. Sienna walked into the warehouse break room looking completely out of place. Her designer white silk suit and expensive perfume aggressively clashed with the smell of old coffee and industrial floor cleaner. She stood in front of my plastic table with a perfectly manicured hand resting on her designer bag. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and absolute arrogance. She did not waste any time with pleasantries. Sienna reached into her bag and pulled out a crisp rectangular piece of paper. She placed it on the scratch table and slid it slowly toward me. I looked down. It was a certified bank check. It was made out directly to me for the exact amount of $20 million. "Take the money and go enjoy your retirement, Chloe," Sienna said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "You fought a good fight, but it is over. Julian belongs to the new generation now. We are taking this company into the future, and you are just an anchor holding him back. Take the buyout. Go rest. Let it go before you embarrass yourself any further." I looked down at the $20 million check. Sienna watched my face very closely, waiting for the emotional breakdown. She expected me to lose my temper. She expected me to scream about my marriage. Most of all, she expected me to rip the check into tiny pieces and throw it in her face like a scorned woman in a cheap daytime drama. I did not do any of those things. I looked up at her and I simply smiled. It was a calm, genuine smile that immediately made Sienna shift her weight in discomfort. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the camera and held it directly over the table. The camera clicked loudly, capturing a perfect high-resolution image of the check, the amount, and the signature. "What are you doing?" Sienna asked, her confident facade cracking for the very first time. I did not answer her immediately. I picked up the $20 million check, folded it neatly in half, and slipped it into my own purse. "I am securing federal evidence, Sienna," I replied, my voice completely flat and professional. "Julian is currently facing a massive board-level crisis regarding forged corporate documents and illegal private equity structures. I am the primary stakeholder threatening his deal. And his mistress, who also happens to be the director of corporate communications, just handed me a $20 million certified check completely off the official corporate books while telling me to walk away and keep quiet." Sienna turned completely pale. The arrogant posture vanished in a single second. Her eyes darted toward my purse, but she was too frozen by panic to move. "That is the textbook legal definition of witness tampering and corporate bribery." I continued, looking her dead in the eye. "You just tried to bribe a primary witness in an active corporate dispute. I am not going to tear this check up, Sienna. I am going to hand it directly to the Federal Labor Board and the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with a time-stamped photograph. Thank you for delivering the exact piece of physical evidence I needed to guarantee your personal indictment." I stood in the break room, watching Sienna practically run out of the warehouse toward her luxury car. Marcus walked up behind me, but before he could say a word about the bribe, my cell phone started to ring. It was an unknown number with a New York area code. I answered the call and pressed the phone to my ear. "Am I speaking with the primary system administrator for the AeroShift Logistics Network?" A sharp, impatient voice demanded on the other end of the line. "You are speaking with Chloe Sterling," I replied, my voice completely calm. The name clearly meant absolutely nothing to the man on the phone. "Listen to me closely, Chloe," the man snapped. "My name is David Vance. I am the Senior Acquisition Director for the Vanguard Investment Group. We are in the middle of executing a $2 billion private equity merger with your chief executive, Julian Sterling. But your entire corporate digital infrastructure just went completely dark." I looked at Marcus, and a slow, cold realization began to wash over me. "Our corporate restructuring team needs to run the final operational valuations before the market closes." David continued, his voice rising with intense frustration. "But we are completely locked out of the core logistical network. Every single predictive routing model just shut down and triggered a massive firewall lock. Julian told us this system was flawless. If this is some kind of internal server crash, you have exactly 1 hour to fix it." I did not interrupt him. I just listened to the panic setting in on Wall Street. "If your central routing system is not back online and fully operational within 60 minutes, Vanguard is pulling the entire deal," David threatened. "We will cancel the acquisition completely and let Julian explain a $2 billion breach of contract to federal regulators. I do not care what you have to do, but get that system online right now." The line went completely dead. I slowly lowered the phone. The Vanguard representative did not know he was talking to the founder of the company. He did not know he was talking to Julian's wife. He only knew that the original 700 lines of Python code I wrote 20 years ago had just triggered a massive security failsafe, locking the entire private equity firm out of the system. Julian thought he could bypass the family trust, sell my company, and fire hundreds of my loyal employees, but he forgot that I still held the master digital keys to the entire empire. And I was never going to turn that system back on. Before I could even process the call from the Vanguard executive, my phone buzzed with a frantic message. It was Julian demanding that I come to his private office immediately. I left Marcus at the warehouse and drove straight back to the corporate headquarters. I took the private elevator up to the executive suite. The glass doors slid open, and the atmosphere was completely different from this morning. The arrogant confidence of the billion-dollar buyout was entirely gone. The executive floor was in absolute chaos. Corporate lawyers were sprinting down the hallways carrying stacks of useless documents. Internal network technicians were furiously typing at their stations, trying to bypass a master firewall they did not even understand. I walked past all of the panic and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the chief executive office. Julian was standing behind his massive custom desk. He did not look like a visionary leader anymore. His expensive silk tie was violently loosened, and his custom-tailored jacket was thrown carelessly onto the floor. His face was flushed red with absolute panic, and his hair was a complete mess. He was gripping his cell phone so hard his knuckles were entirely white. When he saw me walk into the room, he dropped the phone onto the desk. "Chloe, you have to fix this," Julian demanded, his voice cracking with a high-pitched desperation I had never heard before. "The entire core infrastructure is locked down. The routing algorithms are completely frozen. Vanguard is threatening to pull the entire acquisition in less than 40 minutes. You need to log into the master terminal and disable the failsafe right now." I did not move toward the computer terminal. I walked over to the leather sofa and slowly sat down, crossing my legs. I looked at him with absolute calm indifference. "I am not doing anything, Julian," I replied, my voice completely steady. "You signed the private equity contract. You told Vanguard the operational assets were fully functional. If you cannot deliver the logistics network, that is a massive breach of contract. I am just a mentally unstable menopausal woman, remember? Why are you asking me to fix your billion-dollar mistake?" Julian slammed both of his hands onto the mahogany desk. The expensive crystal whiskey glasses rattled violently against the wood. "This is not a game, Chloe," he screamed, his face contorting with genuine rage. "Vanguard is not just going to walk away. If this deal collapses, they are going to sue me for misrepresenting the company assets. They will freeze my personal accounts. They will destroy my entire public reputation. I will lose absolutely everything." I stared at him, letting the heavy silence hang in the room. "That is exactly the point, Julian," I said softly. He stared back at me, and the reality of the situation finally broke through his narcissism. The anger drained out of his body, leaving only raw, pathetic desperation. He walked around the large desk and closed the distance between us. He actually dropped to his knees right in front of the leather sofa. The great Julian Sterling, the untouchable chief executive, was kneeling on the expensive carpet, begging me. "Please, Chloe," Julian pleaded, his voice shaking with genuine fear. "I know I made mistakes. I know I handled this badly, but we built this company together. You cannot let 20 years of our work burn to the ground just to punish me. I will make it right. I promise you I will make it right." He reached out and tried to grab my hands, but I pulled them back sharply. "I will give you 30%. Julian bargained, his eyes wide and frantic. 30% of the entire Vanguard payout. That is $600 million in pure cash, Chloe. All yours. No strings attached. You will never have to work again. Just type in the administrative override code and let the transaction clear. $600 million for 5 minutes of typing." I looked down at the man I had been married to for 2 decades. He honestly believed that money was the only language left to speak. He believed that $600 million could erase his betrayal. He believed it could erase the forged federal documents. He believed it could justify firing hundreds of loyal employees and stealing their pensions just to secure his own future. "You still do not understand what is happening in this room, Julian," I said, looking down at him with absolute pity. "I do not want 30% of your corrupt private equity deal. I do not want Vanguard to transfer a single dollar into your accounts, because I am not here to negotiate a better divorce settlement." I stood up from the leather sofa, forcing him to look up at me from the floor. "I am here to watch your entire empire collapse," I told him, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "The Master Security Override Code requires 2-factor biometric authentication. It requires my fingerprint and my encrypted password. And I am going to stand right here in this office and watch the clock run out on your perfect life." I did not stay standing. I walked directly around the massive mahogany desk and slowly lowered myself into Julian's custom leather executive chair. I leaned back, getting comfortable in the seat of power he had guarded so fiercely for 2 decades. I reached over to the control panel on the desk and pressed a single button. The heavy window blinds automatically closed, and the large projector screen lowered silently from the ceiling. "Julian, you have spent the last 10 years so incredibly busy building your hero image for Forbes magazine that you completely forgot how basic intellectual property law actually works," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the darkened room. "You built a narrative that you were the tech genius. But the core predictive routing algorithm of AeroShift, the exact proprietary technology that Vanguard is paying $2 billion to acquire, has never actually belonged to this company." Julian stared at me. The panic in his eyes was instantly replaced by a deep, hollow confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Marcus walked forward, stepping right into the beam of the projector. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single, aged document secured in a clear folder. He slid it across the mahogany desk, stopping it right in front of Julian. 15 years ago, when this company was desperate for venture capital and staring at bankruptcy, my client made a very specific legal maneuver. Marcus explained, his voice echoing with absolute authority. She did not just write the core algorithm. She legally registered the patents and the intellectual property rights under a completely independent holding company that she owns outright. Julian looked down at the physical contract. His hands started to shake uncontrollably as he read the title of the document. AeroShift does not own the logistics network. Marcus continued, delivering the final crushing blow. My client simply leased the exclusive usage rights to AeroShift for exactly $1 a year. And because you decided to forge federal documents and attempt a hostile corporate takeover, she legally terminated that lease agreement at midnight last night. The silence in the executive office was deafening. I watched Julian slowly collapse into the leather sofa, holding the termination contract in his trembling hands. The devastating reality of the situation finally washed over his face. "You do not have a $2 billion tech company, Julian," I said, staring at him from his own desk. "You have an empty corporate shell. You have some warehouses and a fleet of aging trucks. You do not own the technology, and you have absolutely nothing of value to sell to the Vanguard Group. The empire is gone, and you have nothing left." The heavy oak doors to the executive office swung open one final time. Julian did not even look up from the leather sofa. He was still staring blankly at the lease termination contract in his trembling hands. But I looked up and watched a tall man in a sharp gray suit stride confidently into the room. He was not alone. He was followed immediately by 4 serious men wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across the back. The tall man stopped in the center of the room and locked eyes with me. "I assume I am finally speaking with Chloe Sterling," he asked, his voice identical to the sharp, impatient tone I had heard on the phone just 20 minutes earlier. "My name is David Vance." I stood up from the executive chair and offered him a single respectful nod. David looked down at Julian, who was now shrinking back into the leather cushions, completely paralyzed by the sudden arrival of federal law enforcement. Marcus stepped forward and walked directly toward the lead agent. He handed over a thick sealed envelope containing the original forensic report, the time-stamped photographs of the illegal corporate bribe, and the digital metadata tracing the forged equity surrender document directly to the corporate communications office. "Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for severe federal securities fraud, wire fraud, and the deliberate forgery of official corporate documents." The lead agent announced, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. 2 agents stepped forward and grabbed Julian by his expensive tailored sleeves. They pulled him violently off the expensive leather sofa. Julian did not fight them. He did not scream or bargain or threaten. He just looked at me with hollow, defeated eyes as the cold steel handcuffs snapped loudly shut around his wrists. David Vance completely ignored the arrest happening right next to him. He turned his full attention back to me and pulled a pristine new folder from his leather briefcase. "My legal team has spent the last 20 minutes reviewing the federal intellectual property records," David said, his tone shifting from corporate aggression to absolute respect. "You played a brilliant hand, Ms. Sterling. Vanguard still wants to acquire the core predictive routing technology. We still want to spend $2 billion today. But we are no longer doing business with Julian or this fraudulent board of directors." David placed the new folder squarely onto the mahogany desk, right where Julian had been begging on his knees just moments before. "We are going to sign a direct exclusive acquisition contract with your private independent holding company," David stated firmly. "As for AeroShift, Vanguard is officially withdrawing all private equity funding and dissolving the merger agreement immediately. Because you own the proprietary network, this company has no technology and absolutely no operational value. As of this exact second, AeroShift Logistics is completely bankrupt." I looked at Julian as the federal agents began to march him toward the glass doors. He had tried to steal my money. He had tried to erase my legacy. He had tried to sacrifice hundreds of loyal employees just to fund a new life with his mistress. And now he was walking out of his own corporate fortress in handcuffs, leaving behind absolutely nothing but an empty, worthless shell. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly, echoing against the glass walls of the executive office. Julian stumbled forward, his expensive leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the carpet. He looked back at me one last time, but there was no arrogant smirk left on his face. There was only the absolute terror of a man who suddenly realized he was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison cell. The lead agent grabbed Julian by the arm and pushed him toward the exit. "You are facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for severe wire fraud and deliberate bank deception," the agent stated clearly as they marched him across the room. As the glass doors swung open, I looked out into the executive hallway. Sienna was standing completely frozen near the elevator bank. Her expensive white silk suit suddenly looked ridiculous. The color had entirely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and sick. She locked eyes with Julian as the federal agents paraded him past her. She did not reach out to comfort him. She did not cry. The horrifying reality was finally sinking in for the ambitious public relations director. She had spent the last 2 years desperately clinging to a visionary billionaire, waiting for her massive payout. But the man walking in handcuffs right in front of her was not a billionaire at all. He was a ruined felon walking into a concrete cell carrying nothing but a massive mountain of corporate debt. Julian tried to say something to her, but she physically took a step backward, pressing herself against the cold marble wall just to get away from him. She knew exactly what a sinking ship looked like. I stood alone in the absolute silence of the executive office and watched the elevator doors close on Julian Sterling forever. The empire he tried to steal was gone. The fake legacy he tried to build was completely destroyed. I walked over to the massive glass window and looked down at the Seattle skyline. He thought he could bury me to build his future, but he forgot that I was the one who wrote the rules of the game. The morning sun broke through the heavy Seattle clouds, casting a brilliant golden light across the massive steel and glass facade of the new central logistics hub. It had been exactly 12 months since the federal agents walked Julian out of his own corporate fortress in handcuffs. 12 months since the entire fake empire he built on lies and stolen credit collapsed into absolute dust. I stood on the elevated steel walkway, looking down at a completely different world. This was not a cold, sterile executive tower, disconnected from the reality of the grueling daily work. This was the beating heart of a completely new enterprise built on absolute integrity and unyielding logic. When Vanguard officially dissolved the AeroShift merger, they were terrified of losing my predictive routing algorithm. They immediately signed a direct operational contract with my private holding company. But I did not just lease them the technology again. I used the massive upfront capital to build an entirely new physical infrastructure from the ground up. I did not want to just write the code anymore. I wanted to command the entire fleet. And as I looked down at the sprawling warehouse floor buzzing with electric forklifts and state-of-the-art automated conveyor systems, I knew I had made exactly the right choice. The transition period during those first 3 months was incredibly difficult. The sudden bankruptcy of AeroShift sent a massive shockwave through the national supply chain market. Julian had left behind a chaotic nightmare of unpaid corporate debts and shattered vendor contracts. But while his highly paid defense attorneys were fighting desperately to keep him out of federal prison, I was busy rebuilding the foundation he tried to destroy. The most important part of the new company was never the advanced technology or the lucrative Vanguard contract. It was the people operating the machinery. When AeroShift legally declared bankruptcy, Julian arrogantly thought the veteran workers would be left with absolutely nothing. He thought his collateral damage was permanent. He genuinely believed that because he had signed a piece of paper sacrificing their livelihoods, they simply ceased to exist. But the very first legal directive I gave to Marcus and my restructuring team was to draft blanket employment offers for every single veteran worker who had been displaced by the collapse. I walked slowly down the metal stairs to the main dispatch floor. The roar of the machinery was completely different here compared to the old decaying warehouse. It was incredibly efficient. It was alive. I walked past a long row of glowing digital dispatch terminals and stopped behind a familiar face. Maria was sitting at the lead coordinator desk wearing a brand new protective jacket with our new company logo stitched over the heart. She was speaking rapidly into a wireless headset, seamlessly directing 3 different massive freight lines across the Pacific Northwest. When she finished the complex routing call, she turned around in her ergonomic chair and saw me standing there. "Good morning, Chloe," Maria said, her face immediately breaking into a wide, genuine smile. "Good morning, Maria," I replied. "I wanted to come down and see how the new automated sorting terminal is treating you today." "It is running absolutely perfectly," she answered, tapping the digital screen in front of her. "The new interface you designed last month has cut our processing time in half. But more importantly, my oldest son just finished his first full semester at the state university. His final grades are absolutely fantastic. He told me last night that he wants to study advanced supply chain management just like you." I smiled, feeling a deep, profound warmth spreading through my chest. When Julian tried to execute his hostile private equity sale, he had aggressively planned to completely terminate the employee tuition assistance program. He was entirely willing to sacrifice the higher education of Maria's son just to add another tiny fraction of a percent to his massive final payout. Now that exact educational program was fully funded, heavily expanded, and permanently locked into our foundational corporate charter. Nobody would ever be allowed to threaten her family's future again. I left the bustling dispatch center and walked toward the primary loading bays at the far end of the facility. The morning air flowing through the massive open bay doors was crisp and smelled of fresh rain and hot coffee. I watched a massive hybrid semi-truck back perfectly into bay number 7 with absolute precision. The driver jumped out of the cab and handed a digital freight manifest to the senior floor manager. It was Thomas. His gray hair was cut short, and he moved across the concrete floor with a renewed, focused energy that I had not seen from him in many years. He spotted me walking toward the loading dock and immediately handed his tracking tablet to a junior supervisor. "We are currently running 20 minutes ahead of our morning schedule today," Thomas announced proudly as I walked up to him. "The new localized routing algorithm is saving us thousands of miles a week on the road. The drivers are not exhausted anymore. They're actually getting home in time to have dinner with their families." "I am very glad to hear it, Thomas," I said, looking out at the massive fleet of white and blue trucks lined up in the yard. "But I am much more interested in how you are doing personally. I saw the final administrative paperwork cross my desk yesterday afternoon." Thomas looked down at his heavy steel-toed boots, and a quiet, emotional smile crossed his weathered face. "I am officially retiring at the end of next month, Chloe," he said, his voice thick with profound gratitude. "My wife and I finally bought the wooden cabin on the lake, the exact one we always talked about whenever you and Julian used to visit the old warehouse. When Julian tried to force the Vanguard buyout, he deliberately reclassified the Veteran Pension Fund as a redundant corporate liability. He tried to legally erase 30 years of Thomas's relentless hard work and extreme physical sacrifice. He tried to steal the money Thomas had literally bled for just to buy another luxury penthouse for himself in Siena. But that retirement money was completely safe now. When I built this new logistics empire, the very first financial pillar we established was an untouchable, independently managed retirement trust for all of the legacy employees. We did not just restore the exact funds that Julian tried to steal from them. We heavily matched the contributions using the initial Vanguard acquisition capital. Thomas was not just retiring safely. He was retiring with absolute dignity and total financial freedom. "You earned every single piece of that cabin, Thomas," I told him, looking him directly in the eye with absolute respect. "You built this physical network just as much as my computer code did. You take your wife to the lake, and you do not ever look back at this place." Thomas reached out and shook my hand. It was a firm, heavy handshake built on 2 solid decades of mutual respect and shared survival. "You saved us, Chloe," he said quietly over the roar of the idling engines. "All of us. We will never forget what you did in that boardroom." I left the loading bays and walked back up the steel stairs to the executive suite overlooking the floor. It was a very modest, functional office compared to Julian's massive, arrogant glass fortress downtown. There were no expensive, imported mahogany desks or crystal whiskey glasses meant to intimidate visitors. There was just a solid oak conference table, multiple heavy-duty computer monitors, and a dedicated team of brilliant people working seamlessly together. Marcus was waiting for me inside my private office. He was wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal suit and holding a thick blue folder. He looked incredibly tired from the endless legal restructuring, but profoundly satisfied with the ultimate outcome. The final quarterly financial reports just came back from the federal auditors, Marcus said, sliding the heavy folder across the oak table. Vanguard is completely thrilled with the digital integration. Our operational profit margins have completely exceeded every single initial projection we drafted. We are officially operating at double the freight capacity of the old AeroShift network, and our overhead costs are significantly lower. I did not even bother to open the blue folder. I already knew the revenue numbers were going to be absolutely staggering. I knew the new business model was a massive, unprecedented success. But accumulating wealth was no longer the primary driving force in my life. The money was simply a tool to protect the people who actually mattered. And the federal sentencing hearing, Marcus asked, pouring himself a hot cup of coffee from the corner machine. I already watched the live court feed this morning, I replied, walking over to the large window overlooking the warehouse. The federal judge did not show him any mercy at all. Julian was officially sentenced to 15 years in a medium-security federal penitentiary. The court also ordered a complete aggressive asset forfeiture to cover the massive financial debts he accumulated during his fraudulent private equity negotiations. The government immediately seized his downtown penthouse, his collection of luxury cars, and completely drained his offshore accounts. He has absolutely nothing left. And what about the ambitious public relations director, Marcus asked with a slight knowing smirk on his face. Sienna completely vanished, I said, watching a long row of delivery trucks roll smoothly out of the central security gate. The exact moment the FBI officially froze Julian's bank accounts, she realized the glamorous billionaire lifestyle was permanently over. She abandoned him before he even had a chance to post his initial bail. The last rumor I heard was that she was desperately trying to get an entry-level job at a minor marketing firm in Chicago under a completely different name. Marcus nodded slowly and took a long sip of his dark coffee. "You won the war, Chloe," he said, setting the mug down on the table. "You completely destroyed the man who tried to ruin your life, and you built a massive empire directly from the ashes of his ego. You are the undisputed queen of the board now." I looked out the window at the incredible sprawling industrial facility operating flawlessly below me. I thought about the forged federal documents, the fake tears he cried in the boardroom, the $20 million bribe Sienna tried to hand me, and the desperate, pathetic pleading when Julian finally dropped to his knees. Julian always thought that power was about ruthlessly dominating other people. He honestly believed that a crown was something you simply bought by sacrificing the innocent people who trusted you the most. But true lasting power is never about destruction or deception. True power is about building something that actually matters and protecting the people who help you build it. I looked down at the hundreds of loyal employees moving safely and prosperously across the warehouse floor. I had kept my original algorithm. I had kept my personal pride. But most importantly, I had kept my promises to the people who relied on me. The bitter ashes of Julian's pathetic greed were completely scattered to the wind, and the brilliant new empire I built was finally entirely mine. The heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse closed with a quiet and final thud. I did not stay to watch the judge read the official verdict. I already knew exactly how the story ended. Julian was sitting at the defense table wearing a cheap gray suit that did not fit him correctly. His expensive corporate lawyers had slowly stopped returning his calls the exact moment his offshore bank accounts were completely frozen by the government. He looked incredibly small, sitting in that massive, empty courtroom. He kept looking back over his shoulder, hoping for someone to support him, but the wooden benches behind him were completely empty. Sienna had disappeared the exact moment the money stopped flowing. She packed her designer bags and left the city before the sun even came up on the day of his arrest. She was always a calculated investment meant for a rising market, and Julian was now officially a permanent financial liability. I walked away from the courthouse and drove back into the heart of downtown Seattle. I parked my car and walked down the busy sidewalk until I stood directly in front of the massive glass and steel skyscraper that used to be my entire world. The giant corporate logo had already been stripped away from the front entrance, leaving only a faint, faded outline on the expensive marble stone. The heavy morning rain had stopped, and the bright afternoon sun reflected sharply off the towering glass windows. I looked up at the top floor, where Julian once stood, and genuinely believed he was an untouchable corporate king. He thought he could build an empire by breaking the backs of the hardworking people who trusted him the most. People in the financial magazines like to call this a story of a bitter wife seeking ultimate revenge. They desperately want to paint me as a scorned, emotional woman who maliciously burned down a $2 billion company just to settle a personal marital dispute. But as I stood there feeling the cold, crisp wind coming off the water, I knew the absolute truth. Revenge is a purely emotional reaction. Revenge is chaotic and messy and driven entirely by a fragile, broken ego. I did not act out of anger or petty jealousy. I simply applied the exact same ruthless, unyielding logic that Julian used to run his business every single day. I protected the innocent workers he tried to sacrifice, and I held him completely legally accountable for his own forged federal documents. I did not take revenge on Julian Sterling. I just handed him the exact, absolute justice he had been avoiding his entire life. And justice, unlike Julian, is mathematically perfect. Exactly 1 year ago, they escorted me out of that massive corporate anniversary party. The wealthy venture capitalists and the arrogant board members looked at me and saw nothing but a quiet, obedient shadow standing behind a powerful man. Julian honestly believed he could just erase me from the narrative and rewrite the history of the company to suit his own massive ego. He thought he could replace me with a younger version and simply pay me to disappear quietly into the background. But they made one catastrophic miscalculation. You cannot kick out the architect who poured the concrete and laid the steel for the entire building. You cannot gaslight the person who wrote the original code and holds the master keys to the entire system. Julian spent 2 decades trying to build a loud, flashy empire built entirely on stolen credit and hollow promises. He thought extreme wealth and absolute arrogance could replace actual competence. But the truth is never loud. It does not need to scream or boast or throw a violent tantrum in a glass boardroom. The truth is cold and precise. It simply waits in the background, quietly tracking every single lie and every single forged document. And when the time is exactly right, the truth always finds a ruthless mathematical way to take back exactly what belongs to it.